And before we get going, here's a word about our sponsors. SDHQ Motorsports is a powerhouse 30,000 square foot facility with 45 family members reporting for duty. This single owner, single location business is based out of Gilbert, Arizona. It can handle anything from a hot rod, daily driver, pre-runner, race vehicle, half-track or Kugelwagen, or just about any other project you need help with. Their skilled staff with hundreds of years of combined experience eats, sleeps, and breathes performance. So go check them out at sdhqmotorsports.com or check them out on Insta at sdhqmotorsports. The We Happy Few 506 podcast is brought to you in partnership with the Gettysburg Museum of History, home of the Major Dick Winters collection and the largest assortment of authentic Band of Brothers artifacts in the world. Visit the free museum at 219 Baltimore Street in Gettysburg, Pennsylvania, or at www.gettysburgmuseumofhistory.com, and on the YouTube channel, The History Underground, Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter.
We few, we happy few, we band of brothers.
Well, hello and welcome along to another We Happy Few 506 podcast, The Nearly Men, with my beautiful co-host Doug Allen in Berlin. How you doing, buddy?
I'm very well, thank you, Matthew. And how are you?
Buzzing. I'm buzzing.
Good.
I'm buzzing because we are going to fall down a nerd rabbit hole this evening. These may be, between the two of us, we're going to fall down a nerd rabbit hole because these are two of my favorite subjects we're talking about tonight. We're going to talk a lot, probably about rugby, which, of course, you know, I'm the world's greatest nose of. And then also the SAS, which you may be the world's greatest nose of. So we're going to get cracking. I'd like to welcome a guest, a very special guest, and thank you very much for coming on the show. It's Gavin Mortimer. How are you doing, Gavin? I'll give you a little...
very well. Nice to be here. Thanks for the invitation.
Thank you. So you've written quite a few books. I'm just going to read a couple. Fields of Glory, which is 16 Warrior Sportsmen. I'd like to talk about that a bit later, definitely. And I think your latest is about two SAS, which is the forgotten story of Bill Stirling. Has that come out right now?
Yeah, that's out and coincided really with the second series of BBC Rogue Heroes, which featured Bill Stirling, and so that was it's an interesting story, and it sort of dovetails all my work about the wartime SAS that's been going on for about 25 years now. So and Bill Stirling was always this is something that only I became aware of the deeper I delved into the research, his influence and also the lack of recognition post-war he received.
Right, and we'll dive deeper into that a bit later, if you don't mind, and the relationship with his brother and the rivalries and the fact that he became kind of the forgotten man of the story. But if you don't mind, I'd like to go right back to your roots. You are a Mill Hill alumni, am I correct in saying that?
You are correct, yes.
Right, so I've got a question here. Not about, I'm a public school boy too, so it's not going to end up in a fight. It may be that there isn't really an answer to this, but what do you think that your time in Mill Hill taught you about life and led you in the direction that you've gone? Because it's my bigger question here, Gavin, is that the British public school system gets a bad rap, rightly in a lot of ways, but also you'd throw the baby out with the bathwater because they actually have an ethos. Each public school has an ethos that they teach and try to mold young men in a certain way. And there's something really great about that in certain ways. And I'm wondering how your time at Mill Hill affected you and then subsequently your work.
Well, that's a big question. Firstly, I was very lucky in that it taught me, I think, self-sufficiency. I went to a boarding school, so when you're 14 years old, you learn to stand on your own 2 feet. Mill Hill was, and I believe still is, a very diverse school. So, for example, in our first 15 rugby back row, I played on the open side. We had a Ugandan on the blind side and a Nigerian in the back row. At number 8. So it was just a wonderful. It, it gave you, I suppose, the self-sufficiency, a lot of leeway. Also, I think an appreciation of how lucky one is to go to a school like that. That was something I've tried to carry through life, and understanding that I was had great fortune to go to a school like that. And also, I was a bit of a disaster at academically. The only two things I excelled at school were, well, three things: rugby, running, and writing. And they indulged my academic limitations, encouraged my strong points, and sort of ignored my disastrous attempts to pass any sort of mathematics or science qualification. But my English teachers in particular, I think, instilled in me a love of language, a love of words, and also, I mean, I studied some great books at A level when I'm going back to Mill Hill actually next later this year to talk to the pupils, which I'm really looking forward to. But I have been thinking about that lately, and I think that's just one thing. Uh, the 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 way that teachers had time for pupils. That's probably the best way of putting it.
Mm.
Yeah. Um, sorry, I've got a slightly facetious question. How were the line out calls going if you had a Ugandan, a Nigerian, and then you as well? Were they okay?
You're talking a long time ago. I've no idea now. We also had a Southern Irish fly half and a Northern Irish scrum half.
Oh wow.
We had a
Oh.
Cypriot in the team and someone of Turkish origin too. It was a real United Nations team, and it was a great camaraderie. Um, but yeah, it was happy days, and it's a time I look back with great fondness and, as I said, a great appreciation.
So was writing a thing that you wanted to pursue early on? Did you want to be, say, a fictional author, or did you want to, where did your love of history then develop? And then obviously you've kind of beamed in on the special forces, the British Special Forces,
Mm.
'cause you've done books on the SBS as well, and also given the talks in front of them as well. So how did
I
that?
went to I went to university actually for 6 months and left because of a groupthink, which I always think is quite interesting when you see sort of, in my opinion, the groupthink that's taken hold in the last 30 years in academia and higher education. This is 90. Now, when I left school, I went to New Zealand. I mean, I was really obsessed with rugby, and
Mm.
so I went to New Zealand for a year to play rugby out there in Auckland. And when I came back, went to university, left there after 6 months, bummed around for a bit playing rugby for London Scottish, and went up to Scotland, played a bit up there, and then gradually, this was also the time of the lads mags. So I began to write. I remember I interviewed Jason Leonard, the great England prop for Loaded magazine. That was my first article, big piece for Loaded. Wrote for FHM. Did a piece for them actually about John Ryan, who the creator of Captain Pugwash. Little known fact. John Ryan was fought in the Far East with the 14th Army. So and then, but yeah, so it's all sort of comes back to my two loves, which are rugby sport, particularly rugby, and writing. And you mentioned Fields of Glory at the top of the show. That was my first book about the 16 warrior sportsmen, one of whom was Blair Paddy Mayne, of course. Now everyone knows his name through Rogue Heroes. And I wrote a chapter about him. And in the course of that, the one SAS veteran who I spoke to was Johnny Cooper. And Johnny Cooper at the time was really the godfather of the regiment. He was one of the originals in 1941, and except for a brief time immediately after the war, when he tried his hand in Civvy Street, he then returned to the SAS, to 22 SAS, and served until 1959. Just an absolutely wonderful man. Loved his rugby, great help. So that's always been a help in my writing career. And it was Johnny who said to me, I said, I'd like to expand the and write a biography of Paddy Mayne. And it was Johnny who said, well, look, I think I may I suggest that there's been a few books written about the wartime SAS, but from the officer class. So Roy Farron, Derek Harrison had written books, and David Stirling, obviously, and Johnny said, "I'll put you in touch with the Regimental Association and write a reference, and then hopefully they'll send it to every wartime SAS veteran." So Johnny
Right.
did that, and I went to see them when they were at the association headquarters in London. And they then very kindly, I made a small donation to the association funds, and they then sent out letters to all the wartime veterans, and I had a wonderful response. This was just at the right time. We're talking now 2001. So most of the boys were in their late 70s, early 80s.
Mm.
Still their mental faculties were still very strong, so able to recollect, but also analyze, critique. And I noticed a big drop off, sort of when you get to your mid late 80s. There's a
Yeah.
big diminution in mental recall. But I got them at the right time, and of course most of them were working class lads who'd never talked before and wanted to talk now because they knew that, that they were in the twilight of their lives, and Johnny's reference helped. So I must have, well, I think I worked it out. I interviewed about, including Special Boat Squadron, about 85 members of
Mm.
so one SAS, two SAS, the two French squadrons, three and four, and then about half a dozen Belgians from the independent company. Took me all over the world, across Canada, Zimbabwe, Italy, across France, Spain. And it was a wonderful 2 years of my life, and enriched me not just as a writer, but as a man. I learned so much from these men, these quiet, unassuming, modest, but
Yeah.
stout-hearted men. And I still find myself from time to time trying to uh, think what, particularly half a dozen who I think I hope they would agree we became friends, and think to myself, what would they do in this situation? Um, and that's how Stirling's Men came about in 2000. That was published in 2004. Um, and it's interesting when I read that back, because, which I don't do very often, by the way, but when I flick through it, because it shows my immaturity as a writer and as a historian, as a man,
Mm.
and particularly, I sort of swallowed the narrative laid down by David Stirling in The Phantom Major, and as I evolved and matured, I began to understand, to see that a lot of what he said was either embellished or just downright untrue. And what particularly opened my mind was in when I moved on to the long range desert group, and I interviewed half a dozen of their veterans. This is 2013, 2014, who were really quite critical of David Stirling. And indeed, the long range desert group kept a wonderful log war diary, and full of the signals, the telegrams, and just personal comments. And you see there what they thought of David Stirling. They had respect for the SAS,
Mm.
but David Stirling really did push them to the end of their tether.
What did sorry, Matthew, what did, so when you were traveling around the world interviewing these men, how would you do it? Would you sit down a tape recorder? Would you take notes of these things that you've hoarded and kept? Obviously, they're very valuable to you
Mm.
emotionally as well as
Yeah, I
and
took a little dictaphone, and with the mini cassettes, and really I would just go and sit down. I think it helped. So I was, at the time, then this was between the ages of 30 and 32. So it helped that I was, a
Mm.
young man with an interest and a knowledge. I'd done my research, and the best way of doing it, I found, was to take the operational reports,
Right.
um, and and photographs, and really just spread them out, and then we'll talk. And as they particularly, I remember I had a great afternoon, and I've got the cassette for this still, in the bar of the Adelphi Hotel just by Liverpool Station, with two Liverpudlians, Bob Lowson and Bob McDougall, and a Cockney, Arthur Thompson, and Arthur Tomo. They were all commandos from 1940, and then they joined the SAS in 42, and they would see each other probably once a year for as a big reunion in London. The Regimental Association were always just so exemplary, looking after the old and the bold, and so Arthur and I got the train up, and we sat down there and got through quite a bit of red wine and beer, and it's very funny. Look, but listening to the cassette, they begin to bounce memories off each other. Oh yeah,
Yeah.
I'd forgotten about him, particularly of the boys they'd served with. Oh, do you remember he used to sing that song? What was it? And then the other one would chip in. Oh, that was Buttercup Joe, and so and so that was and
That brings
so
it to life, right? These
it
little moments bring
absolutely
it to life.
brings it to life for me. Yeah, and that's what I try to do with Stirling's Men, really to put to bring these characters back to life.
Mm.
And I think probably the greatest tribute for me is that not one of them complained
Yeah,
about
yeah,
the book.
yeah.
Um,
Fantastic.
I gave it just to Bob Lowson. I gave it to Bob to read the manuscript before I sent it to my editor, and I've still got the list of um, his comments that uh, reading the manuscript, but they were fairly just technical questions or things
Yeah,
about what they may have worn, but nothing. Oh, this isn't so.
nothing substantive. Yeah, yeah,
No, no, and so it was just, I think, as I said, they wanted to talk, and along came me at the right time with the right interest. I think the fact that I haven't got a military background helped, because I
okay.
was I was
You don't
just
have an agenda, I guess, then. Is that
absolutely. I didn't have an agenda. I just wanted to hear them talk, and I might nudge them and I didn't even really do that. Listen, thinking about it, we just sat and talked, and if I had any questions, I would raise them. But just more often than not, as they began to talk, they would more memories
would come? Yeah, yeah,
would come to the surface.
yeah,
And then often I found that they would phone me up a day or so later, or right. I've still got just actually looking to the left, I can see it, a big file full of the letters that they sent me.
yeah,
And because obviously this was the email was around, but none of them. I
yeah,
remember Ray, just digressing momentarily. I remember going up to stay with Bob Lowson. He lived in Wirral. This would have been in summer, I think, of 2005, and he'd got a computer with email, and he said, "Now someone's a friend has said that I really should be emails a way to go, and it will save me a lot of time and bother keeping in touch with family and friends. How does it work?" So I tried to, for about 20 minutes, I tried to explain, and then eventually Bob just very quietly put his hand on my shoulder and said, "You know what, son? I'm 85. I don't think I've got time to bother about things like this."
yeah.
And so so yeah, so it was just a wonderful time of my life.
And what? Just to go on from that, how do has any of them responded on the subsequent? Obviously, because of the Afghan war was starting, obviously around that time as well, around the time that you first meet them, and now there's reams of books, and it seems like a lot of people are talking. What are their kind of thoughts on this
That's
new wave of being a little bit more open? Are they a bit suspicious of this, or because this doesn't really seem like the Special Forces way, does it? Because they get quiet for 80 years, pretty much, right? 70
yeah, they
years.
did. That's a very good question. Firstly, it's very interesting that when I was interviewing them, I did most of the interviews in 2003 when the Second Iraq War kicked off.
Mm,
We would talk about that because often we would have lunch, go to the pub for a pint afterwards, and only one of them, if I remember rightly, supported they supported the troops, but
Mm.
not the reasons for going in. And they
Right.
said, what we have now is a political class who've never experienced war, never
Mm.
been to war, and they're blasé about war. On the subject, we did talk, one or two of them. Uh, no one approved of Bravo 20, the book there. Firstly, they said, it's it was a very poorly planned operation for a
Yeah.
start. But they don't. I mean, had I not, that's why Johnny Cooper's letter was so important, and the fact that it was endorsed by the Regimental Association, because they then contacted me and said,
Yeah.
well, if you've got the green light from the Regimental Association and the approval of Johnny, we'll talk. Had I not, they wouldn't have,
Right.
because
Right.
it still is very family, and there
Mm.
was no way that they would ever risk betraying that. And so they do view books written about fairly recent operations as
Mm.
as a betrayal, because they know that the regiment doesn't like it.
Right.
And So yeah, and I went to one of the I think two of the annual reunions, with as a plus one of, as it was, this chap Bob Lawson, um and just it was wonderful, because you see them, they're all in their early 80s, but the banter was flying, the beer and the banter was flying, and they were just like young men again. It was just
Yeah.
wonderful to be part of it and listening and just taking the mick out of one another. It was fantastic. But within that, there is a very, very strong camaraderie.
Yeah, I mean, this is something we experienced on Band of Brothers. I mean, nothing to that extent, but when the real guys that we played would come over, Babe Heffron, Bill Garnier. I mean, I've said this many times, seeing Babe Heffron in the distance or Bill Garnier in the distance talking to a couple of actors, and I swear the air around him was fizzing. It
Yeah,
looked like the air around, there was just such forces of nature. And
yeah,
and
yeah,
they would go out, take the boys out for a bit, drink them all under the table, and then
yeah,
be out on set like the next morning before anyone and looking
yeah,
brightly and ready to go. And we're all
yeah,
totally screwed, and not over the bits. So it's yeah, I kind of definitely get that. Yeah,
yeah.
wonderful. What wonderful experience, Gavin.
Yeah, no, it was. I mean, as you just alluded to there, Band of Brothers, by the way, is still in my view, they're sort of the yardstick of all World War II dramas. It was just brilliant. But yeah, as you just alluded to, they're just a special breed.
Yeah, yeah.
On to the next question really nicely. Thanks, Doug. Is You also wrote a book about what that generation could teach us.
Yes.
Um, Researching and writing about that, what was the touchstone, or what was the one thing that you just kept coming back to? If there was one, what was the one thing that they could teach us that you just think there's something about these guys, like Doug says, the air fizzes around. There's something completely different. I had had the pleasure rather of being around these guys, of several veterans, of being around the 1966 World Cup winning team. Weirdly enough, on a TV show, they have a weird aura about them as well.
Mm,
Something aura about great men, and that
yeah.
entire generation of these great men. What is it that they can sort of teach us, as we and the younger generation and everybody just seems a little lost at the moment? Don't you feel?
Hmm.
I do. I mean, one of those, that book, which actually was inspired by COVID. I wrote that during the first lockdown,
Right.
when there was lots of politicians. Yeah, the great Matt Hancock was telling us, invoking the Blitz spirit, etc., etc. About time, and we look back on, you just think, what was that all about? But uh, I suppose a sense of duty and conscientiousness, and that's why, the book was called Guidance from the Greatest Generation, and I do think that's an apt moniker, because obviously the First World War generation, went marched off to war, and suffered greatly, but also showed extraordinary courage and stoicism. But they went off to war thinking it would be over by Christmas,
Yeah.
and also with a sense of naivety. Not the World War II generation. Their fathers, their uncles had fought in the Great War. They knew about the horrors of war. Um, but they went off nonetheless. They went off willingly, and they they just had a sense of duty to their country, to their regiment, to their unit, and within that duty is I think a self-discipline and a self-respect. And I suppose self-discipline, if we apply that today, I mean, I think that we have lost that sort of self-discipline, sense of self-responsibility. One interesting thing of all the veterans that I met, not just uh, SAS, Long Range Desert Group. I wrote a book about the London Blitz. So I interviewed. That was a great time going around. I'm from London, going around the East End and the Elephant and Castle, speaking to Londoners, most of whom civilians or far fighters, far women, far men. Not one of them had sort of let themselves go. They're all still quite fit and kept in shape and just had uh, a respect for themselves, a discipline. They all got up early. I have to say, but again, I'll digress from time to time. Jim Booth served in something called COP, the Combined Operation Pilotage Party, which was a Royal Naval Special Unit. He was in a mini submarine. He went across from Portsmouth on the 2nd of June, and his job was in with five others in their X-craft was to mark the eastern end of the invasion beaches, so Sword Beach. And they spent 2 days at the bottom of the channel and then came up and signaled in the fleet. And he said, I remember he was there sort of as the fog lifted. Uh, they'd surfaced, obviously, put up the lights and the beacon, and as they turned through the fog, they saw the invasion fleet, and he said, "Bloody hell, you'll never forget that sight." But when I went to see Jim, who lived in Taunton, he was 96 at the time, and I turned up. He was a widow. I turned up at his bungalow. Knocked. I think it was about a 9:30. We'd agreed to meet, and there was no answer. I thought, oh no, the old boy, perhaps he's still asleep or he's. So I hung around. I sort of waited on the doorstep. About 10 minutes later, car pulls out, a car pulls in, out jumps Jim in his shorts and t-shirts with a box of carrots, and he'd just been up his allotment digging up his carrots. And he still cycled his house back onto some playing fields, and he ran round the playing fields twice a week, and he also cycled into Taunton to get his groceries once a week. And he was just the most extraordinary man I've ever met. And he died a couple of years ago, aged I think 101. But actually, well, he wasn't that extraordinary for his generation because
Mm.
so many of them were like that. They just carried that um, that that sense of discipline, sense of duty, and sense of self-respect through life. And I think that that's something that we've lost now, and we've become, dare I say it, and I think I mentioned this in that book, a bit of a slovenly race of
Yeah,
people.
no, I'd agree with that. And it's not just like because my dad's 92
Right.
and he still rides a horse in Epping Forest.
Yeah.
He only stopped playing tennis like a year and a half ago because he can't get about.
Yeah.
He's really unsteady on his feet. He cycled Land's End to John O'Groats when he was
Yeah.
83. Do you know what I mean?
Okay.
And like he was a kid in the war in the East End in the Essex borders. So I think it was just growing up because obviously rationing was still till 1951, and I think that's a
Well,
big part of it. So you couldn't all this want that we have now and
uh,
getting stuff. You didn't even have the basics then were rationed, and I think that when you spend a long portion of your life, even as a child, with that in mind, then you are just a different personality, aren't you? You do have a bit more resolve. You do
yeah.
respect what you have and want less, which is what my dad has been like his whole life.
Yeah, absolutely. No, my mum, who's 83, still plays tennis, and she make do and mend. That's still ingrained in her,
Yeah,
and she won't throw anything away. And it's but and yeah, so she was born in 42, so it's very much the yeah, absolutely lingered on sort of. It's also, I think they're known as the silent generation, so the generation born
yeah,
sort of in the 30s. But yeah,
yeah.
no, very much they have that too, and. And no, I mean, but I don't want to get, it's too heavy and sociological on this show, but I think it's something that sort of happened really in the
Yeah.
60s and changed then.
There is,
It's a bit.
yes, sorry, Matthew. There's just one final question I want to ask, just on your just general experience around hanging with these guys, is that okay? So you interviewed or spoke with some sort of 85 Special Forces operatives over SAS and SBS, a long range desert group, which seemed to me like the SAS before the SAS. I mean, they look like, and the show, which isn't obviously my pretty much my only exposure to it, which I know isn't that realistic, but they seem like it. What was the most what was the most common quality that they all possessed? Was it just humility? Is that one of the things that they what stood out the most as being the most consistent quality amongst all the people that you met? What was
Other
it?
than
Simple humility, or was it something
Yeah,
else?
humility and another H, which is humor. They all had a very,
Yeah,
a humor, I think that, and there's a great line that was told to me by Tony Greville Bell, who was a young officer in 2 SAS, who said that um, you, you know, something always goes wrong in the British Army, and it's full of cock-ups, but you can't let them get you. You've got to meet each cock up with a laugh. And wars are won by the side that reacts quickest to the cock up. And I think that's a quality that's sort of quite not unique to the British stroke sort of Australian Canadian army, but it's very among Anglo-Saxon armies. I think, it is an ability to not let uh, to keep calm and carry on. If I
yeah,
can if I
yeah.
can
Essentially, yeah,
pull out a cliche, I think that really is an expression that still resonates today, and it's so I think it's that a mixture, which is why they were such wonderful men to speak to, because
yeah.
they were modest. It was never me, 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 me. It was
Mm,
they're always downplaying their and often they would tell me that they'd been awarded a military medal or a DCM or a military cross, and I would say, may I ask why? And I would say, oh, it was just we shooting up a German convoy, something like that. I can't quite remember the details now. And then I would go to the National Archives and dig out their citation, and it was something quite
something
astonishing.
remarkable, yeah.
Um, but they just didn't like talking about it. And so yeah, it's just that quality of of a of a of a, a gentleness. There was no real a sort of a steely gentleness, if I can put it like that. There was no real. They weren't aggressive or gung ho. It's always strikes me. I've written a book about Merrill's Marauders, the American Special Forces unit, and I love speaking to the Americans. But one thing I've noticed is that American veterans still, or certainly for World War II veterans, still are quite like wearing military paraphernalia, whether
Yeah,
it's the baseball caps or
mm,
insignia. The British, not at all. They
oh,
hated
good.
that, and
No.
several of them said, "Oh, I like going to the SAS reunions because you see your mates and you have a few beers, but I don't like the Remembrance Day parades because I don't like dressing up and and getting the medals out and with the flags. It's not my thing." And it's interesting. I was recently reading George Orwell, and his essay, "England, Your England," and he was talking about he'd written this was written, I think, in the sort of the middle years of the war, talking about why fascism never took off in England, apart from pitiful Oswald Mosley in his short-lived black
Yeah.
shirts, but compared to the rest of Europe. And he said it's because the British just find the sight of a strutting military type
ridiculous.
in his cavalry boots and his big hats with feathers ridiculous. They just won't
Mhm.
tolerate that nonsense. And I think that's sort of I think there's an element of truth to that. We don't like it, and it's a sort of paradox, a contradiction, because while we're very proud of our military past, we like to remember it. I think in a in an or certainly the veterans themselves in quite an understated way. They don't like the jingoism, and
Yeah.
uh,
Interesting. Yeah.
Yeah.
it's it may change sort of slightly these days. I mean, it's interesting to see over VE Day. I'm very pleased that we're remembering VE Day, but I do sort of feel that it's a little overblown these days, and it's the same with Remembrance Sunday, that you see TV presenters begin to wear their poppies in October. It's like Christmas. It comes earlier and earlier each
Yeah.
year,
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
now you can get poppy you can get poppy dog leads, you can get poppy beer mats, you can get poppy everything, and the money goes to the British Legion, so that's good. But I can't help thinking it's slightly diminishing
Yeah.
the
No,
real.
I agree. Yeah. Interesting.
It smacks of virtue signaling, which is there's nothing more horrendous than that, really.
Absolutely,
But you
absolutely.
make a good point. I think that what makes us, what I love about being British, being English, is the fact that we do have this incredible sort of proud military history, but also with a nation of Monty Python's Flying Circus.
Yeah,
You know what I mean? And that's what stops us being fascists. I think
yeah,
is we
yeah, absolutely. Yeah,
any type of
yeah.
ridiculous, and we can't help taking the mick out of it. And that
Mm.
sort of squaddy humor that I grew up with, I come from military
Yeah,
background, is ingrained in me as well. That just
absolutely.
nothing is beyond pricking it. Do you know what I mean?
No,
Nothing.
no, that's what I think. So, what makes Dad's Army, in my opinion, a work of genius, because Captain Matt it captures all the diversity of a British national character, but it also captures there's an element of a fascist in Captain Mannering, by which I mean he's that rather pompous, strutting type who wants to really a little power crazy, and how Sergeant Wilson continually but very subtly undermines him, and pokes fun at him, and the joke's always on Captain Mannering really at the end. And it's just a brilliant, as you said, it's a brilliant example of that sort of self-deprecating British humor. But nonetheless, and I think it's interesting. I've studied the First World War to a degree, that of the major powers, so Russia, France, Germany, Britain, who were in from the start, the only one that didn't suffer a serious mutiny was the British Army. Um, and nothing like the obviously well, we know the Russians, but the French and the Germans. And I've often thought that may have been because of that sort of quiet stoicism and the ability to find humor in the most dreadful of circumstances. And there was a you may remember it, about must have been about 10 years ago, there was a drama on, I think, BBC, the Wipers Times, about the Trenches newspaper,
Yeah.
and the success it had. And I remember something. It was like um, officers officers flak jacket they had these steel breastplates for sale. Um, Slight damage, one previous owner. And this is a genuine advert in the. So you think we were able to laugh in the trenches, and I think that's such an important quality. And I mentioned it a few minutes ago, but several of the men did say, you've just, when things go wrong, you've just got to try and find the humor, and particularly the absurdity. And there is a lot of absurdity in soldiering, in the
Mm.
petty rules and regulations. And if you don't let it get to you, and if you're among like-minded men, I think that's a great help.
Yeah, but didn't like the SAS, because one of the things that seems to be about them and their formation was their lack of pomp, was the lack of all this, square bashing, folding your rack neatly, polishing brass. I mean, and all this kind of stuff. I mean, is that true? Was it really like that? Was it a little bit more relaxed? Was it full of kind of bit more mavericks? Because you mentioned earlier about the guys that you spoke to, they were, the books that had been written by the officer class. Um, and it seems to me that the SS, I was listening to a podcast recently where they say the SS is like very different, because if they got an operation in World War II, it was the men themselves that planned it. It didn't come from the sort of top down. Like they would have an objective, like we need to take this bridge or this railroad or whatever. But the men would actually plan the mission themselves because no one knew what their capabilities were because they were so new, when the SS were in France and stuff. And did that kind of break the barriers of the traditional military chain? How did it all work
Well,
back then?
that's I would take issue with that the men didn't in World War Two. I believe that they may do post-war, but certainly in
Mm.
World War Two, the men didn't plan the operations
Okay.
themselves. It was the officers, and of course they had very good officers.
Mm.
Paddy Mayne, as I've written in a couple of my recent books, in a way, the capture of David Stirling was a blessing in disguise because he'd he was the man to get the idea off the ground.
He
Um,
was more than anything, he was a politician, wasn't he?
yeah, he was absolutely very well connected. He had this extraordinary self-confidence, and um, and Caro being quite a clique at that time because his mother was one of the great British socialites of the interwar years. She knew everyone. She had Stanley Baldwin, the Prime Minister, to tea, and Queen Mary, the widow of George V. So she knew everyone, and that gave a real social standing to David Stirling and also to Bill Stirling, who was in Cairo at the time. But David Stirling then was the man to get it off the ground, to get the equipment, to get everything that they needed. But he then needed it really plateaued a little bit in 1942. They were very reliant on the long range desert group. They didn't, for example, really have any. They had to have headhunt Mike Sadler from the Long Range Desert Group as a navigator. They didn't have a. They were reliant on the LRDG for signals, for logistics. David Stirling wasn't an organization man. He was a bit like the actor who just goes on stage and says, "No, no, don't worry. I don't need to rehearse. I don't need to learn my lines. I'll just hoof it on stage." And that sort of got him so far. But then, of course, when they became a regiment in
Yeah.
September 1942 and expanded to about 500 officers and men, that's when he really became he was out of his depth. And I, as I wrote in my biography of Stirling, I suspect that he spent some time in hospital in November 1942. I think he was physically and mentally worn down. And I think at some level when he went on this madcap adventure into Tunisia to try and link up with the British First Army as they came south from the top of Tunisia.
Mm.
I think at some level he was inviting capture because he knew that he was out of his depth. With him out of the way, that allowed Bill Stirling, George Jellicoe, who then became CEO of the SBS, and Paddy Mayne to really take hold of the SAS. Paddy Mayne rinsed it of a lot of the officers who'd been recruited by David Stirling on the back of what school they went to, what university they went to, and if they liked a gin and tonic. Paddy Mayne got rid of that strata and began recruiting purely on your ability as a soldier. He also took charge of training, and of course, I argue that 1943 was the pivotal year for the SAS because it's when they really became went from being a sort of a private army as they were called in the desert to
Mm.
a commando force and a very effective one as they showed in various operations in Sicily and Italy,
Mm.
and that then laid the groundwork for when they returned to France. And again, they had to adapt to parachuting in behind German lines in France. And because they had this training, physically, mentally, technically, they were able to adapt much better than had David Stirling been in command. Um, so I think that but going back to your original question, – they were um, Again, I don't agree that they were. If anyone were rogues, it was the long range desert group. A lot of long range desert group. I've got a list of charge sheets of long range desert group soldiers from when they'd been guardsmen in the Scots Guards, the Coldstream Guards, or the Yeomanry, and they
Excellent.
when they were recruiting the LRDG for the yeomanry and the guards patrol, what Ralph Bagnold, the CO, did was he went to various. He had a very fixed idea. He thought guardsmen and the yeomanry regiments would provide the soldiers best suited to the long range desert group. And he went and he said, just give me your bad eggs and I'll turn them into good eggs. And he did. So um,
Because that was stolen in the show, isn't it? As the
yeah, it
technique
is.
that they
Yeah.
used for the SAS. But you're saying so. And what was the long range desert group? What did they? Because they only come in that bit of the show to sort of then they start driving them around. But
Yeah.
what
Well,
were they called for? 'Cause they look like the SAS already existed in a way, in some way.
they did. No, they did, Doug. It's a good point. They were formed in June 1940. Ralph Bagnold, who was a First World War veteran, had been posted to Egypt in the mid 20s, and he became um, fascinated by the Western Desert, so Egypt and Libya, the Great Sand Sea. His work, by the way, he was a scientist at heart, and his work on the Great Sand Sea is still well, certainly was used by NASA in the 60s, preparing for the moon landings because similar texture. And so he's a bit of a legend, Ralph Bagnold. And so he had this idea so he knew the interior of the Libyan desert, where, of course, the Italians were. And from so he was in Egypt from October 39, when Britain and Italy weren't yet at war, but it was fairly obvious that was going to happen. And so twice he went to um, Middle East Command and said, "Let me raise a reconnaissance force. My experience, and there's a couple of other officers who were with me when I explored the desert in the late 20s and early 30s, and we can penetrate deep behind Italian lines and really bring back intelligence." And it wasn't until in the early summer of 1940, when Italy did declare war on Britain, that it got the go ahead. And so he initially his first patrol was made up of New Zealanders. Then he raised a Rhodesian patrol, and then the two British yeomanry patrol and the guards patrol. And although they are now a more associated with reconnaissance and intelligence gathering, their road watches were legendary, where they would go 500 miles behind the lines. And in a patrol was usually about 15 men, and in pairs for 24 hours. They would overlook one of the coastal roads, one with a pair of binoculars, one with a notepad and pencil, and they would
Wow.
note down all the enemy traffic going
Yeah.
both ways. And I've got some of these road watch reports, and they're incredibly detailed, to the point where what songs they were singing, indicating the state of their morale.
Right.
But they did also go on some raids, quite effective raids from January 41. They attacked, there was the most famous, 1,500 mile round trip from Cairo to attack Merzek Fort. Um, and shortly before the SAS was formed, which was in August 41, the Long Range Desert Group did propose to Middle East Command of expanding to become much more of an aggressive offensive force. But then
Mm,
when Stirling came along, the LRDG thought, well, actually, this is quite good. We could complement one another.
mm.
And then, as it's been well documented, the first SAS raid, the inaugural one in November 41, was a disaster. 50 coincided with the worst storm in 55 men went parachuted in, only 34 came back. They
Yeah.
probably would have um, died then and there had not the LRGG, and it was the LRGG,
Cambridge. Yeah.
Jake Easton Smith said, "Look, why don't we know the desert like the back of our hands. Let us take you to your targets." And so began a very fruitful 8 month period where the LRGG would take in their Chevrolets and their Fords, take the SAS to within about 5 miles of a target, drop them off, arrange a rendezvous point. They would go in, um, blow up so many German aircraft, shoot up so many German mess rooms, and then slip back to the long range desert group who would transport them back to one of their Oasis hideouts. So yeah, no, the LRGG were very were absolutely essential to the and as the LRGG would told me, the veterans I spoke to, we were the brains, the SAS were the brawn. That's probably quite a good way of
Yeah.
putting it.
Do they still exist?
Doug, just to finish just to answer your question, which I've been rambling on for a long time. Don't forget that the SAS, they all came, the original ones, from the commandos. So they were very well trained, very
Right.
well disciplined.
Yeah.
Not They weren't roguish. I interviewed about four of the originals. I mean, a lot of the ones who came in early 42, and they all said, the question I asked everyone, why did you volunteer? Because we were bored, because there was a lot of time in the Middle East sitting around doing bugger all, and we'd had all this commando training, and it's like the football player, who trains for weeks on
Mhm.
end, or and never gets to play a match, and
Yeah.
they wanted to play a match. So when the call went out for this new unit, they all jumped at the chance. It wasn't for glory or
Yeah.
anything else. It was just to
Get
put
to
really
work. Yeah.
to put into practice what they trained for.
Yeah. Interesting.
Kevin, I have because we'll keep you for sort of an hour. We won't have too much of your time, so I just kind of want to round out on this because I reckon there's probably enough time to talk about this. And this is about the disbandment of the SAS after the war. Um, and I know you've written about this, and I know you've written about this, and you've written about military establishments since, particularly. Was it in the Economist or the Spectator? I know I read the Spectator. I know I read the article. So at the end of the war, when the SAS is disbanded, what is the establishment thinking behind it, and are they telling the truth, or do they feel that the SAS are a little bit of a rogue force that they can't control?
I think a bit of both, but particularly the latter. There was a famous line that I mention in my history of the SBS. Simon Wingfield Digby, who was a Conservative MP somewhere in Somerset, I think, stood up in Parliament in 1944 and accused the SBS of described them as a bunch of renegade cutthroats out in the Aegean,
Well, they better.
and that bringing shame to the British Army. At which point Winston Churchill told him to shut up and sit down, or he would send him out to join them. And there was always an element within
Brilliant.
David Stirling himself, called the top brass. Not all of them, obviously. Auchinleck and Wavell in particular were very alive to the potential. But he described a lot of the staff officers, and particularly at the beginning, the resistance, he described them as layers of fossilized shit. And he had a good turn of phrase, David Stirling. And
Mm.
he was right and Freemasons of mediocrity. That was another one. So there was
That's
always an element, and I think you could say the same thing about Bomber Command, that when the war ended, within the British establishment, there was an attempt to airbrush out the most unsavory aspects of how we'd won the war. So Bomber Command, Special Forces. I remember collaboration on the Channel Islands, which was quite rife, has to be said. And this was all okay. Let's pretend that never happened, and we'll just concentrate on the glorious parts. And And so, and of course, uh, essential to that was the victory of the Labour government in the July 45 election. Churchill, the man who had raised the was it the butcher and bolt, as he described the commandos when he went in June 40? He said we need a commando force based on his experience of the Boer commandos when he was in the South African War as a young reporter. And so he was very much an advocate of special forces. And his son Randolph Churchill served for a very brief time in the SAS in the spring of 42. He was as one SAS veteran described him, a big, fat, lazy, blubbering load of no good. But he was very essential to it, David Stirling got him on board and took him on one operation because he knew, and I mean, he probably said to him, I'll take you on this operation. It was to Benghazi, a Libyan port. If you then write to your dad and tell him how wonderful we are and that to give us everything we want. And so that's exactly what Randolph Churchill did. And I've seen the letter he wrote to his dad. And apparently, when Winston Churchill got this letter, he was so proud. He was showing it to everyone, even though really I think he should have been trying to keep hush hush about what British Special Forces are up, but he couldn't. But he was very much I mean another he was also impressed by Wingate Churchill,
Oh
and
yeah.
of course Merrill's Marauders, the sort of the American version of the Chindits, if I can put it in simplistic terms, came about because Churchill took Wingate to Quebec, the Quebec Conference in 43, introduced him to Roosevelt and said, let's have an American special forces in Burma. And that's how the Merrill's Marauders came into being. So as he was always had a soft spot for these sort of maverick, unorthodox warriors. And so, but once he was out of number 10,
Mm.
in comes the Labour government. So I think there's still a residue of, 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 of distaste for special forces and but also a belief that the war was over. We had no longer a need for this type of
Mm.
unit because yeah, in 1947, 2-1, the territorial um, unit of the SAS was raised by Brian Franks. 2-1, by the way, was he was the CO of 2 SAS. So when he raised this new territorial regiment, he called it 2-1 just to wind up 1 SAS because he put the two first
Right.
and then the one.
I
And
see.
so that's why it's 2-1 SAS. And back came it was full for those first 2 or 3 years
Mm.
of veterans of the war so several of the veterans I spoke to from 1 and 2 SAS they jumped at the chance to rejoin. A lot of them found Civvy Street pretty hard to adjust to and wanted that camaraderie. They were sent initially to via Malayan emergency and then in 1952 um,
Yes.
2 SAS as we know it today came into being, and they very much based their training and particularly the selection of men. Um, Dan Newell, who was a 2IC at the time, he wrote to the commanders of the Long Range Desert Group and the senior officers of a wartime SAS to say what should we look for in recruits, what characteristics are best, and so it was the SAS, the 2 SAS of the 50s was very much the template was as what had happened in the war. And of course, then we had the the small wars as the British Empire began to break up,
Mm.
and they were sent particularly into to Aden and Oman, and they
Yeah, I
were
think the first one I read about in a book in the 80s was Oman, when a very small unit was facing like 600 soldiers in there and a couple of 88 guns or something. And they were, yeah, it was some incredibly,
as a Battle of Mirbat in 1972, yeah, when they
right, yeah.
about a dozen held off, yeah, these 600 tribesmen. Yeah, an extraordinary.
Is it?
So yeah, it was a strange time, but I do think that there was an element of where because you see this throughout the war that there was a certain type of officer who didn't approve of irregular warfare, and
Mm. Is
was
it
hostile
true?
to it and
Is
saw
it
the
true?
opportunity
Yeah.
to do away with them in 1945.
Is it true that Montgomery wasn't a fan, but Patton was? Because didn't Patton kind of
Eisenhower
Sorry, because
was a
he had
huge fan.
control of them for all their operations in France and in the the whole Battle of the Bulge, but after that and before
Yeah.
that. But Montgomery wasn't a fan. He didn't like him, did he?
I think it's more he certainly wasn't enthusiastic, and in his memoirs he doesn't mention them. He mentions
Oh,
them
really?
once, yeah, just in passing. I think it was more he didn't like David Stirling. He found him impertinent, which he was, and
So was
um,
Sorry?
so
so was
yeah, so Shane Hackett, who was his job in 90 in the autumn of 42 was to in charge of the raiding forces and really so and his job was to divide up the sort of territorial disputes that were arising between the Long Range Desert Group and the SAS, and he said it was quite hard to control David Stirling and Montgomery. There's a letter I've in my history of a long range desert group. I reproduced it, a letter that Montgomery sent in April 43 to Guy Prendergast, who'd taken over as CEO of the Long Range Desert Group from Ralph Bagnold, in which he was effusive in his praise of what the Long Range Desert Group had done, really in hastening the end of a war, the sort of a sweep into Tunisia, the left hook, as it was known, that was done by the Long Range Desert Group, who pioneered this route round terrain that the Germans had thought impassable. So
Right.
he was much more in awe of the Long Range Desert Group than he was of the SAS. But I think it was more a personality clash. And but no,
Right.
but Eisenhower, and in fact, two SAS, Bill Stirling, that really two SAS came around because of Eisenhower, because he wanted, um, uh, he'd seen that the SAS, he'd heard of what they were beginning to achieve
Yeah.
in the autumn of 42, after the Alamein offensive, as the Germans began their withdrawal. The SAS by now was A Squadron under Paddy Mayne and B Squadron under Stirling.
Mm.
Paddy Mayne, A Squadron was comprised mainly of the originals of experienced
Veterans
men,
from
but he
Africa.
took
Yeah.
it into the desert and was really harassing the Germans as they retreated, as they withdrew west. And Eisenhower heard about this and said, "I want a similar British force in the Western Mediterranean," and that's how two SAS under Bill Stirling came about.
And was Bill like the perfect man really to take this on from, like as you said, like David Sterling was the perfect guy to get it going. He was the dreamer. He was the one with all the connections. He was the charmer. I mean, that's how he's portrayed in the show anyway. I know
Yeah.
it's however accurate it is. But what was Bill's greatest kind of talent? I mean, was he was the right guy to take this on from there? He was the right guy at the right
Yeah.
right time. You would just
David Sterling was a typical younger brother, brash, and he was very brave and very gung ho and a little bit reckless. Bill Sterling was the eldest of six. They were an aristocratic family. So aged, their father died when he was 21, so he became laird of the Keir estate, which is in not too far from Dunblane. Huge house, huge grounds, huge staff. He was very much a local figure too, attending church fetes, meeting dignitaries. So he had a natural power of command. He was 30 when he joined SOE in very early on in the war in 1940, and then set up a guerrilla training school. He was 30 in 1941, and so really he was a chief executive type, and he was a great organizer, a great administrator, also very well connected. I mean, in Rogue Hero season two, I thought the best character, the most accurate character was Bill Stirling, in that he
Right.
was a much more sober character than David, but unorthodox nonetheless. And the wartime
Okay.
joke was that SAS stood for Sterling and Sterling. It was a team effort, and it was post-war that David Bill had so many business committee commitments. He had quite a big business empire in Africa and in the UK. He was running the estate. He was looking after his various siblings, some of whom had successful lives, others didn't. David didn't really. He went to Southern Africa immediately after the war, but he was sort of a bit of a lost soul. And it was only after the death of Paddy Mayne in 1955 that he wrote this book, The Phantom Major, published in 1958, which, as I referred to at the top of the show, that's when he began to embellish his own achievements and
I see.
denigrate those of Paddy Mayne, and so began this portrayal, completely inaccurate, of Mayne of being this dark, brooding, indisciplined, wild, drunken Irishman. He liked to drink like any good rugby player, but he knew when to drink and when not to drink. And of all
Because
the
that's
veterans I
how he's
spoke to,
portrayed. Yeah, that's how he's portrayed in the show. He's exactly the man you described, but how
I'm
actually
afraid Rogue Heroes.
got him completely
I
wrong.
think I'm very pleased that it shone a light on the wartime SAS and
Yeah.
the contribution of the French SAS, and but the one thing that is just so wrong as to be offensive is the portrayal of Paddy Mayne. Also
Mm.
because he's just so annoying. He's just so po-faced and sanctimonious. You just want to slap him and say, "Stop quoting poetry and just relax." And so they get him completely wrong.
Yeah.
And he was you know he was a qualified solicitor. He just got a
That's
job
right.
working at one of the Belfast top solicitors before war broke out. He was a British Lions tourist.
Yeah.
And I spoke to a couple of when I wrote Fields of Glory, I interviewed a couple of men players from that tour who toured with him, and said, yeah, he liked to drink. We had some good times, but he was utterly disciplined on the pitch, not violent at all, completely controlled. And as I've said before, the best description I've had of Paddy Mayne was given to me by Mike Sadler, who said, I sat next to Mike the last time I saw him. He died last year, the last of the sort of the Desert SAS. Last time I saw him was at a long range desert group lunch in 2017, and we sat next to each other. And I said, "How, Mike?" I'd interviewed Mike several times, and how would you just sum up Paddy Mayne? And he thought for a moment. And he said, "Controlled recklessness." And I love that because it's
Mm.
in a way that's what you need for rugby. You
Mm.
need to be very aggressive, very reckless to stick your, particularly if you're a forward, to stick your head where you shouldn't really be sticking your head. But everything has to be controlled. And Paddy Mayne he wasn't wild, he wasn't indisciplined, and so it's such a shame that and I know his family have been pretty upset at the depiction in but of course, that's how we'll be remembered because it's TV, and the power of
Yeah.
TV is much stronger than the power of the book.
Mm.
So to wind down and to wind up, I could do a whole podcast on
Yeah, we could talk for
Yeah,
hours.
yeah,
Yeah.
Mike Sadler. By the way, I'm obsessed with Mike Sadler. I've watched every interview on TV of him. I've read about him. I think he's just one of a great British.
yeah.
But we'll go back to Paddy Mayne and him being a lock on the British and Irish Lions tour and everything. And we'll round out with just one simple question for you, Gavin. It's been brilliant. Who plays 10 in the British Lions this season against us?
Finn Smith.
Me too,
Well,
I think as well. That's what I
yeah,
think.
I just think that I've been so impressive in this calendar year. When he began playing it in the Six Nations, he was a bit shaky at start, but he's just grown into the role. And watching him for Northampton recently, he sees things so quick. He sums up situations so quickly. He knows when to kick, when to pass. England, I think, in the past have been guilty of just sort of rugby by numbers, kicking when you get to a certain area in the field, but he seems to sum up what's going on. And in the way that, say, Antoine Dupont does for France, they just have an ability to see things a split second better, quicker than the other players. So I'll definitely have Finn Smith. It's looking good for England. It's been a barren few years. I'm half Scottish, so I always like to see Scotland do well. But it's been a barren few years for England. But when you look at some of them, I mean Henry Pollock, wow.
My next question, does Henry Pollock go? This we might end up editing this out in case we kill everyone with boredom. But does Henry?
Oh, definitely, definitely, and because it's Australia, I think he's in with a shout of a test of a test spot because Australia aren't they're not where it's South Africa or certainly South Africa and New Zealand too. But I think he's got the game that will work best against Australia. But I'm talking to you from France. I'm a big Toulouse fan. I've watched I think just about every Jack Willis game this season, and Jack Willis for me still is. He's the number. Like I said, I'm an open side myself. He's the number 7. He's the open side's open side. If you get what I mean, that he's more. Henry Pollock still very young. I'm sure he'll. He reminds me of a young Michael Jones actually, Henry Pollock. But I just like Willis. His in defence, in attack. I just think he's got a better all-round game at this point in their careers.
Excellent. Well, we'll round out right there before we nose ourselves to death about rugby. Wonderful. Thank you so much for coming on, Gavin.
It's been a pleasure. I really enjoyed it. And yeah, invite me back anytime. Always happy to bore on about the war.
Brilliant.
Yeah, definitely have you back on, Gavin. It's been lovely to meet you, and I wish you well. I'll see you again
Thank
soon.
you, Doug. Thank you both. Thank you, Litchi, and speak to you soon.
Cheers, buddy.
Bye.
Bye. Well, that's pretty awesome.
That was fantastic.
We didn't even get on to Mike Sadler in the long range. We could do.
I know. We have to get him back and talk about the LRDG because they seem.
We'll just do that whole episode of that.
Yeah, I think we should because they seemed like the SAS before they were called the SAS. They were doing all the same stuff, and they all seemed like the same sort of guys. And it was great to listen to. And yeah, if anyone's listening, buy his book. He's written so many books on the Special Forces.
Oh, it looks like about 12 of them. And
12 books, yeah. So, and we'll definitely have him back on. And yeah, what a fantastic guest. Yeah, really, really interesting. Got to listen to him for hours.
Brilliant.
Hours.
Just to round up, just sum up for you, mate. I saw Rick Warden and Tim Matthews yesterday. It was in Oldbourne. They were opening a plaque to Harry Welsh and Dick Winters where they stayed, which is in the old post office, which is now Bistro. Went down there with Warden and he did a really good speech. Opened the plaque. It's like a blue plaque. It's really cool. It's a really good day.
Oh, wow. That sounds wonderful.
Yeah.
How were they? They both well, Rick and Tim?
They're like Rick Warden's great company, and then Tim looking like, Bob Dylan.
Yeah, he is, isn't he? Yeah.
Traveling sort of like troubadour vibe. It was really cool. It was really nice. I sent the video to Colleen Welsh, which is Harry Welsh's granddaughter, which Rick told me she calls him or called him Pops. I think her father actually died really young, and I think Harry Welsh actually raised her. And so he's more like a father figure to her. So She found out that I'd done that, taken the video, and I just sent it straight to her, and she was like really made up. She's going to be in Boston, I think, so she'll see Rick there, and it'd be great. I don't think they've actually met face to face.
Oh, what really? Oh, wow.
They've
spoken a lot, haven't they? And they've they've had a lot of correspondence between them since.
Yeah, they chatted on the Zoom when we did the Zoom. It was really cool, but I think this is the first time they're actually going to meet. So,
oh, fantastic.
All right, buddy. Well, it's been great. Well, listen, thanks everybody for listening. As usual, thanks to our Patreons. Thanks for supporting. And we're definitely going to get Gavin back on, and we'll probably just do the Long Range Desert Group and Mike Sadler and all those guys because we barely even touched upon that. And some of that.
Yeah. And if any listeners has any questions they would like to ask about them, then just send them in, and we'll get him on again in the next few weeks, hopefully. Yeah, that'd be fantastic.
All right.
Cheers for listening, everyone. We wish you well. Ciao.